Hey guys, hope all is well. Glad to be with you on this Sunday. Um, it's been a pretty crazy weekend. The World Championship match is underway. We're 2 games in, and I want to give you a recap of those games. So in this video, I'm actually going to give a game analysis of Game 1 of the match, which was on Friday, between Magnus Carlsen, world champion Magnus Carlsen, and World Championship challenger Sergey Karjakin of Russia. Just to speak a little bit about the players for a second, Magnus Carlsen has been world champion for quite a while now. He's defended his title twice against Anand, and Karjakin won the Candidates Tournament that placed him in this position. Karjakin is originally from Ukraine, but he switched federations at some point because he felt like Ukraine wasn't giving him the proper financial support that he needed to move upwards and onwards. And well, Russia has definitely given him that support. I've heard there've been plenty of reports out about him getting special sports trainers and psychologists, and of course the seconds and the assistants that help you analyze games. He's gotten a lot of support behind him. You could say he might be one of the last sort of young, really young Russian hopes to sort of topple Carlsen in the very near future. Although maybe Jan Nepomniachtchi might have something to say about that as well. But anyways, you get the point. Carlsen is really something to be dealt with, and Karjakin is a worthy competitor. So this is Game 1, and let's see how it goes. So there's always a lot of speculation about the openings of the match, at the beginning of the match, and Carlsen went for d4, which was not a huge surprise. He's played d4 a lot before. He has also played e4, knight f3, c4. But what came as a surprise is the next move. After knight f6, bishop g5 was played, and this is known as the Trompowsky, and it got a lot of attention for political reasons, because the Trompowsky sounds like Trump. We had an election last week, and really interesting choice from Magnus. Now, he has used this before, effectively, I might add, against Kramnik, I believe, in 2013. And if you want to study that game, that's definitely a game worth studying. I think it's 2013 Tau Memorial, Carlsen-Kramnik. And he put on a masterclass in the ending. So the advantage of playing the Trompowsky is to get sort of a good, get your opponent out of theory pretty quickly, and then just get a playable position. Other merit to this is White is actually threatening to spoil Black's kingside pawn structure by playing bishop takes f6. And although White gives up the 2 bishops for that, sometimes that pawn structure being spoiled with double pawns can be very annoying. As I like to say personally, no pawn break, no plan. And sometimes it's tricky to get in pawn breaks if your pawns are doubled. So Karjakin made the very standard move d5 here. And the idea is actually just sort of to ignore that the threat of the double pawns and say, well, it can't be that bad. And Carlsen is up to the task. He challenges, so he plays e3 first. First solidifying the pawn on d4 and just sort of waiting a little bit to see what Black will do. And then after c5, Black attacks the center really quickly. And now that Black is sort of attacking the center, now Carlsen decides to double these pawns by going bishop takes f6. And here, the idea that Black has when playing this system with d5 is typically g takes f6. Note, I just want to point out that e takes f6 is not typically the move that you want to be making, simply because now you can envision a scenario where the d5 pawn is actually an isolated pawn after a subsequent capture on c5 at some point. Maybe not here, because the bishop would just develop with a tempo, but you can imagine a scenario with like bishop takes c5 and c3, something along these lines, and this d5 pawn is isolated and weak and can be effectively blockaded and pressured. You always want to keep in mind pawn islands, and here White would have 2 pawn islands and Black would have 3 by virtue of that d5 pawn being by itself. So that's just a sample idea of why g takes f6 is typically played. And now after g takes f6, white plays d takes c5 first, just sort of snagging that pawn. Since the e takes f6 wasn't played, the pawn isn't protected, you want to sort of take it. And it also introduces this idea of maybe playing against the d5 pawn in some lines too, which can be a little bit loose. So knight c6 was played, basically just developing, influencing the center. E6 might have been also an option, but typically you want to keep yourself a little bit more flexible than that. Now the bishop wouldn't have the scope. And typically it's pretty difficult to defend the c5 pawn anyway by playing b4. It's a bit double-edged, but it's something that maybe Carlsen was thinking about. So that's why knight c6 is played first, because you stop this b4 push, and black can basically secure the pawn a few ways by playing queen a5 check, or and then queen takes c5, or e6 and bishop takes c5. But knight c6 basically stops this b4 move. So bishop b5 was played, pinning the knight on c6. And typically we say knights before bishops when we're developing, but the Trompowsky is one of those weird openings when you actually develop the bishops sometimes before the knights. So that happens. When I was looking at this position live, I thought rook g8 might be a viable move, just sort of attacking the g2 pawn here, and essentially putting pressure on the piece on the square that the bishop just left defending. I always like to say when you're playing chess, whenever you move a piece, you move it away from squares it was previously defending. And here, the bishop on f1, just a second ago, was defending g2, and now it's a little bit loose. However, I don't know. You definitely forfeit the right to castle when you play rook g8, but I thought it would be an interesting way to go, because the other thing is that white doesn't really want to make a move like g3, because then it weakens these light squares a little bit too much. So it would have been an interesting question how black was going to play that. Instead, Karjakin played e6, sort of this sort of safe and secure move. You're going to take the pawn on c5 back, and yeah, it makes a lot of sense, frankly. So e6 was played, and then c4, and yeah, this was essentially Carlsen's idea. So he wanted to sort of play against a potential isolated pawn on d5, and basically just get some decent piece play and a variation that maybe is not as explored as much as the heavy variations that Karjakin is typically playing. So the theory, there's theory here. There's theory everywhere in every opening, but it's a bit more unclear than some of these lines where you're coming up with the first creative move in the teens, like 15 or 16. So c4. Also, I want to point out b4, very, very risky move, because it's probably just bad because you're weakening. Yes, you're holding onto the pawn temporarily, but you're weakening way too many squares. And in fact, yeah, I don't like it at all. I really don't. I can already see an idea like bishop d7, sort of threatening the b4 pawn right away. And then if you give up the second bishop, that might have consequences like bishop takes a6, b takes e6. This bishop's already bearing down on g2. And there's also this idea of playing b6 at some points. Like if I just make a sample move like knight f, like I don't know, maybe h3 for instance. b6 might undermine that chain further, and you sort of go down a rabbit hole like c takes b6, bishop takes b4 check, and your extra pawn. Your pawn structure here just doesn't look very good, and black has good control of the center and the two bishops. So safety first is the name of the game when you're playing black in a lot of these World Championship matches. Unfortunately, you really can't afford. You don't want to lose the game, so you play really not to lose in many ways. So e6, c4, d takes c4, and here you see the queens are opposed. But a queen trade is pretty much out of the question for white, simply because if queen takes d8, king takes d8. I'm showing a lot of variations here just so you guys understand some of the thought process that's going on during the game, or why they actually move really quickly and ignore these types of lines. Black would be the only one that could sort of play for an advantage, because black has the two bishops, and black's king can pretty much go to c7 and is relatively safe. And the material will be equal after bishop takes c5. So that would be ill-advised for white to go down that road. So instead of after d takes c4, white plays knight d2, and the point is to keep the queens on the board and sort of maybe play against the structural weakness that black has on the king side. So after knight d2, bishop takes c5 is played, recovering the pawn. And now knight gf3 was played. And you might ask, why didn't the bishop capture the pawn, or why didn't the knight capture the pawn on c4 first? Well, the knight didn't capture the pawn on c4 because, like we said, this queen trade would not be something that white would want, because there's really nothing to play for. White can't really hope for an advantage at all if the queens are off the board and being down the two bishops advantage. And taking with the bishop is also ill-advised, because if you took with the bishop here, this bishop is actually biting on granite. That's like what I like to say when there's sort of two pawns like this that sort of are protected in the way of the bishop on a diagonal. There's no real future scope for that bishop, so it doesn't really make sense. Another point behind keeping the bishop on b5 is actually to sort of entertain the threat of bishop takes c6 at some point. And that's going to be something that I talk about in a few moves. So knight gf3, castles. Black also could have considered playing c3 here. The idea is to sort of shatter the white pawn structure. It's a common theme in certain lines like this, where after d takes c4, white's going to get the pawn back, but sometimes black wants to give the pawn back in an inconvenient way. And after c3, b takes c3, you would create another pawn island for white, which may not be welcome. Now, at the same time, it's not such a big deal here because maybe the open b file will be compensated for it, and the d4 square would be well protected for a piece to just hop in there like a knight. So c3 wasn't played, but it definitely could have been entertained. So castles was played, and then castles. And here again, the c3 move can come into question. But here, I thought Karjakin played a very, very strong move, and one that I didn't immediately look at, but I sort of understood what was going on after, which was knight a5. And knight a5 is brilliant. Maybe I'm sort of a little bit too enthusiastic about it, but I feel for the average player, it's really unclear why that was the case, and here's why. This pawn is going to be lost, but the knight on a5 is really not doing so much effective on c6, and so it was really good to exchange a minor piece that isn't so effective for one that might be with this knight on d2 or this bishop on b5. Because white's objective in this position is to play against this black's weakened king side. And so to trade some of those pieces, it gives less of an opportunity for white to take advantage of that king side. So that's one point. Another point is that, again, white doesn't necessarily want to trade the queens right away, because then it might be difficult to get something going against this weakened king side as well. So that's a third point. A second point. And a third point is, in this previous position before knight a5, bishop takes c6 could certainly have been entertained at some point. Let's say black played a relatively lazy move like a6. After a6, bishop takes c6, b takes c6. This bishop on c8 really lacks the scope of any diagonals because this a6 move got in the way of the bishop maybe going a6. It is also doesn't really have much of a future on the c8 h3 diagonal either, unless black was bold enough to play e5. And so as a consequence of that, this pawn will be picked up quite quickly with either rook c1 or queen c2 or queen a4, something like that. And and excuse me, the two bishops don't mean so much in this position, because the c8 bishop is so bad, and the bishop on c5 is, like we said, biting on granite on this diagonal. So really, knight a5 was clever because it's just trading the right minor pieces. And excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of OJ. Carlsen's favorite drink, I might add. Well, back in the day it was. You don't see him drinking OJ so much anymore, but I like it still. So knight a5, really big time move. And so again, white doesn't really have a convenient way to take this pawn, because we don't want to play knight takes c4. Bishop takes c4. We don't want to give up that bishop so quickly like that. So White played rook c1, and the point is to sort of maybe take on c4 and not trade queen. So maybe take on c4 with the rook and sort of avoid the trade of queens that would come after knight takes c4. And here I was so impressed by this next move as well that Karjakin played, because it just shows good defensive skills essentially. And he played bishop e7. And the point is that if you notice in the position before bishop e7, black doesn't have any minor pieces around the king. That is a recipe for trouble in many positions. If you don't have minor pieces around the king protecting it, it's not a sort of a good sign, particularly when black's kingside structure is already ruined. So really, really clever to play bishop e7 and go back. Now, in this position, you could already entertain maybe the bishop on e7 actually shifting to a better diagonal. I was thinking about f5 and bishop f6 at some point. Not right away, but at some point. But there's also just this, bishop e7 was just clever because it was a prophylactic move, moving it away from the C file where it potentially could have been attacked. So, and now again, white doesn't really want to take on c4 here, because bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, knight takes c4, queen trade, rook trade. Yes, white has the open files, but it's tough to imagine there being a real serious advantage here with black having the two bishops. And in fact, he might even be able to just trade a pair of rooks here with rook d8. And it's tough to see how white would make progress here. Try and nibble on the white queen side. Even though white is more developed, it's tough to see how one could make progress here. Although not impossible, but it's tough to say. Maybe rook d8 is not the best move, but Carlsen decided to go another route. And after bishop e7, went queen c2. And I think the point is now to sort of recapture the perhaps to recapture the pawn, but also just sort of to see what white's going to do to develop, just see what black's going to do to develop the rest of his queen side. And Karjakin played bishop d7. It's just simple enough, trying to trade the pieces. And after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7. Again, knight takes c4 doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because after knight takes c4, there's rook a c8. And then this pin trades would ultimately result, in the knights being traded. Oh, not rook b8, rook c8. And the knight's being traded here, and there's just not much here. I mean, even though there's a structural deficit, the bishop is a good defender, and it's a solid enough position that Karjakin wouldn't have much trouble holding it. Especially when in this position also, white would have to play a move like b3. And after knight takes c4, b takes c4, again we see these pawn islands, which are not something you want to see. So after bishop takes c7, queen takes d7, Carlsen comes up with I was impressed, pretty much the only try to play for something more than just a quality, which is queen c3. And the point is that black's knight on a5 has been there trying to get exchanged after a subsequent capture on c4, and Carlsen is like, no, 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 I do not want this trade, and is really, really hoping that the black knight goes back to c6, where white would be able to keep a pair of minor pieces on the board and recover the pawn at the same time. That would be hugely advantageous to white. And it turns out it's sort of tricky to defend this knight on a5. If you play b6, it's a move that's a little bit ill-advised because you weaken some light squares. And you might saying, well, there's not a light-squared bishop. Why are these light squares weaknesses so important? Every weakness is important, and you just want to avoid creating weaknesses. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then again, the knight shouldn't really go back to c6. So Karjakin played queen d5. And with queen d5, essentially you protect the knight, and you still renew the potential of exchanging on c4. And so finally, Carlsen was like, screw it, I've made all my useful moves. I have to eventually get this pawn back. I can't let him keep it by playing playing rook a c8. So here, knight takes c4 is played, knight takes, queen takes, rook takes, and now we're at this position where there's just been a huge liquidation, but white might be able to play for something because he's first to the c file, the open files with the rooks. And so black really can't allow rook c7 here. It's out of the question. So black plays rook c8. Whether it was the f rook or the a rook, it wouldn't have mattered so much. But Karjakin would have played rook fc8. And Carlsen wants to keep the pressure on the c file by playing rook fc1. And then after another capture, because again, white's controlling that file, rook d8. And here's the critical position of the game, in my opinion. Because black is threatening mate, but white does control the c file. And here, there was a lot of chatter on different sites about the right move. And I saw this position live, and I was telling one of my students, Carlsen is going g4. Carlsen must go g4, 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 g4. And the reason I was screaming g4 is because not only do you give your king a luft or air space so that there's no back rank mate, you also provide you stop a potential f5 pawn break. And there are a few openings. I challenge you to look at some lines in the Queen c2 Nimzo or even the Catalan, where good knight versus bad bishop becomes a theme with these types of double pawns after g takes f6. And basically the point is, if this g4 move just sort of stifles the f5 move, which would sort of allow the black bishop to get to an active diagonal one on f6, and it also just clears some space, and it potentially allows for maybe knight d4 in the future, where e5 would be out of the question because then the knight would come to f5. And if the knight goes to d4, it also blocks the rook on the d file, and so white would seem to have a positional superiority. So g4 was begging to be played, in my opinion, just because it's a space gainer. Again, protects the mate, maybe restricts the black pawns on the king side. And it also establishes a nice light squared complex, because you see this knight on f3 and this pawn on g4, really establishing a nice light square complex. I was thoroughly shocked when he played something else. But let's try and figure out why g4 wasn't played. Probably should have done it. The only reason I think he maybe had second thoughts was because of h5. Karjakin's a world-class defender, so I wouldn't put it past him that he would have seen this, but I still would have gone g4 because it's tough to make this move in the first game of a match where you're under pressure. And the idea with h5 is just to undermine this g4 pawn. And the point is that is illustrated is that if g takes h5, just seemingly winning a pawn, black can actually think about going king h7 at some point, and then just going king h7, king h6, king h5, taking this pawn, and it's pretty hard to defend. Now at the same time, the rook can potentially enter on c7, so black would probably have to go rook d7 first, just to cover the seventh ring. But then after king h7 and king h6 and king h5, and it's pretty hard to defend this without losing your coordination. And these double h pawns h and a pawns aren't really particularly valuable assets as far as pawns are concerned. So I think that was what maybe Carlsen was a little bit wary of. Now, I still would have argued that it should have been played, because if h5, one can go h3. And sure, black gets rid of the weak pawn island. That was the case, right? This h-pawn, which is by itself, and could take and take. But here, I'd argue that you could still put some pressure on black's bishop, because this bishop won't have an effective diagonal if he can't play f5. So if with knight d4, king g2, king f3, or king f1, king e2, with that knight on d4, I would have taken white every day of the week. Like, I just make some moves just to show you what could happen. These are just ridiculous dummy moves, but let's say king g7. Say black just sort of chills. I can totally imagine a scenario where like white sort of pushes and then tries to get some light square domination like this, and then after an e5, now the e4 square would be really weak, And then imagine a relocation like this. This would be like a pipe dream, you know, where the light square domination would be in full effect. The bishop would be bad. The rook would still have the one open file, and white's king would be way more active than black's king. Now, I know this is, I mean, again, I made a million moves in a row, but you have to sort of like try and go for, you know, like the small pressing advantage, and I thought this is a way Carlsen could have gone for. So I'm going back, but I was very disappointed that g4 wasn't played. Instead, Carlsen went for g3, and I'm just not impressed. After g3, rook d7 covered the 7th rank, needed to be done. And then Carlsen went king f1, wisely bringing the king to the center. But again, now you give Karjakin this option of playing f5, and you don't give a good player more than one chance to play a good move that's especially going to free up some of the pieces. And this bishop on f6 finally has a diagonal. And so that was really where I thought the chance sort of slipped away for something to really get tangible. And so we're going to zip through some of these moves pretty quickly, but that's where I thought something got let go a little bit. So king e2, just bringing the king towards the center. Bishop f6, attacking b2, must be protected, b3. And you see white has a good light square establishment on the queen side, but on the king side, he doesn't have that yet. And so really that's the problem, is black has staken out this claim on the king side with some of these light squares like g4 and e4, and the bishop is just doing the dark square control job. So yeah, disappointing. So king f8, h3. And I thought here Carlsen was getting back on the right track. Like, hey, now you can go g4, right? And now Karjakin went h6. Clever waiting move. Many people were thinking, oh, why not h5 to sort of, you know, stop g4 once and for all. And the reason I thought that was a questionable move is actually because now this bishop has to stay on the would have to stay on the h4 d8 diagonal, because rook h4 could come at any moment and pick off the h5 pawn. So so I thought h6 was more clever. And here I was like, g4, 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 please play g4, Magnus. And he played knight e1. Okay, relocating the knight, but I thought g4 needed to be played. King e7, knight d3, king d8. And now, again, I think g4 should be played. But you can see that black has effectively managed to make some progress, moving the king to the queen side, controlling the entrance to the 7th rank with 2 pieces so that the rook could potentially move somewhere else. And also sort of hitting the threatening to trade rooks with rook c7. And again, it's hard to imagine the good knight versus bad bishop endgame really happening if there's no light square control on the king side. And now Carlsen, I think he still should have gone g4. But I think he was getting a little bit frustrated because he hadn't, Karjakin made all the proper defensive moves and was not finding a way to make any more improvements. And he played f4, which I really was just shaking my head at, because now after h5, black essentially has 2 backward pawns, the e3 pawn and the g3 pawn, that could be captured by enemy black pawns, and it has no light squared control whatsoever on the king side. So there's just no advantage here. I couldn't believe that g4 wasn't played. And again, you got to give credit for Karjakin for making the good defensive moves and being a bit stubborn, but still shocking. So a4 was played, trying to do something, establish some light square control on the queen side. But now the result was no longer in doubt to me, because with two backward pawns on the king side, it's hard to imagine there being any way to put any real pressure, even if you do have a good knight versus bad bishop ending. So the game fizzled out pretty quickly. We had rook d5, knight c5, b6, knight a6. Sort of clever move by Carlsen, like still trying to play on. This is sort of his trademark. Even when he has nothing going on, he plays on. And the knight is a bit of an annoying piece there, just controlling, sort of establishing some sort of light squared bind, but it's not really a bind. as Karjakin improves with the next few moves. Bishop e7, knight b8, knight c6 a threat, so a5, knight c6, check, king e8. The rook endgames are totally drawn. This h5 pawn doesn't even seem like a weakness anymore. Carlsen tries to keep the piece on a little bit longer, and then trades rooks. And then we have a few checks, a few knight moves, and peace offering. And it's probably a bit of a disappointing result for Carlsen, and a pretty much a really good solid defensive game by Karjakin. I thought that Karjakin almost too willingly went for an endgame that was worse for Black. But Karjakin is a good defender, and he has good judgment in terms of what positions he thinks he's comfortable holding and which he's not. So I think sort of the contours of the match have been set. Carlsen is going to try to play with the white pieces, right, with a small advantage and press that, and you saw that here. And Karjakin, the stubborn defender that he is going to sort of make Carlsen bang his head against the wall to get something going. And I think this is going to be a challenge for Carlsen because in the past he's had, with Anand, he had an older opponent that did not have the stamina to withstand pressure for long periods of time. And I think Karjakin will be up to the task with that most of the time. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. And I'm really interested to see if Carlsen goes for Shrumpowski the next game, because I doubt it. I think in some of the initial games in the beginning of the match, I like to call them red herring openings. You play these openings that sort of you want to throw off your opponent's scent, so that for later games they like over prepare for stuff that's not actually going to happen, and just sort of get them out of their boots a little bit. But thanks for watching this game 1. I'm going to do a game 2 relatively soon, and I'm going to try and cover every game of the match. So stay tuned. Bye.